about, and I hope that comes across tonight. Next slide. So a little bit about the condos in this area. A lot of the multifamily high-rise buildings here were built 60s and 70s as rental housing. They were built at a time when concern for energy was relatively low. Now, condos are facing what I like to call a perfect storm of financial pressures. Rising utility costs are putting pressure on operating budgets. Aging infrastructure is also doing the same. And you combine that with oftentimes buildings have a lack of adequate reserve funding to replace those things when they start to fail. Increasing delinquencies and foreclosures, declining property values, all of this together equals trouble. So just to illustrate energy in the 60s, I like to have something people can relate to. This is the 1964 Buick Skylark Custom Sports Wagon. It had what is the equivalent of a 4.9 liter, 356 horsepower V8 engine. It weighed in at a svelte 4,000 pounds. On a good day, on the highway, going downhill, this got you 15 miles to the gallon. And at a time when gasoline averaged 30 cents a gallon and the price of oil was $2.28 a barrel, who cares? It's a great car. Moving on. Today, I think times are changing, energy prices are changing, our priorities are changing, our behavior are changing, our purchasing power, our purchasing decisions rather, are changing. And what do we have? We have the Toyota Prius, which on a bad day gets 50 miles to the gallon. That is quite an improvement. Move on. So, talk a little bit about our goals, Abaris Realty's goals. We see an opportunity for us to provide leadership by showing how energy efficiency can be an opportunity for condominiums. Not a burden, not a cost, an opportunity to help them mitigate some of their financial pressures. And our ultimate goal is to develop a retrofitting program that all of our clients can take up. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about the triple bottom line. Who here has heard of the triple bottom line? Show of hands. Just a couple. It's a popular theme in corporate social responsibility. It's also very popular in the world of international development. It basically means you think about an investment from multiple perspectives. So often when we think of green, we think about it as an environmental investment, and I think that's wonderful. We're all here because we care about the environment, right? Do you guys care?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just want to check. Make sure you're still listening. But oftentimes it's seen as a luxury, and I think that there is a strong case to be made for the economic benefit of going green, and that's what we're going to highlight next. Next slide, please. There's a building that is one of our clients. I'm not going to say who, but they might be here tonight. And they're right here in Bethesda on Battery Lane. They were built in 1971. They have 70,000 square feet in space and 54 units. They are master meter and central plant. Who here lives in a master meter condo? So you know very well that if your neighbor wants the heat on all winter while they leave their windows open, you're going to help subsidize that. It's a problem. The annual utility costs of this small building are almost $130,000. It's not a small amount of money. It's the single largest item on their budget. Next slide, please. So we ran a comprehensive, and real quick, let me stop here and I'll say, I'm not going to call it an audit. I am officially boycotting the term energy audit. I think the term itself, it raises like negative feelings. You might as well call it an energy root canal. We're going to call it an opportunities analysis. So we ran an opportunities analysis, a very comprehensive one. It identified a number of conservation measures. I'm not going to list them all, but what I want to draw your attention to is the bottom line. Always the bottom line. For about $60,000 in cost, this analysis identified savings of approximately $30,000 a year. That makes for a payback of 2 years. In investment terms, that's wonderful. Next slide, please. If you consider the cost of the assumption I made here in the 10-year savings, I assume that energy would rise 3% a year. It's a very modest assumption. The 10-year savings on this building, if they implemented this project today, would be $288,000. For a $60,000 investment, they would save $288,000 in change. For your average unit owner, for the families that live there, that works out to $5,341 per family over 10 years. That's a lot of money. And the net present value, what that means in today's dollars, today's money, $200,000. So nothing to sneeze at. Next slide, please. So I want to get into a little bit about the project life cycle. First, I want to talk about how can property management companies help. Some of us are out there thinking about this, others are not. And one of the things I think we can do as an industry is provide leadership and support. We can help our communities understand why to go green, and more importantly, how. And we'll talk about that a little later. I think it's important to note that we have a macro perspective. So we manage 120 communities in our company. There are thousands of communities nationwide. Management companies have a good understanding of what's reasonable, what's not, how you relate to some of your peers. But more importantly, we have a micro perspective in that we manage your community. We're there every day. We know your governing documents, we know your board of directors, we know your problem tenants, we know your facilities operations, we know your contractors. In fact, I would argue that nobody knows you better than us, and that is very, very valuable. And finally, we have a trusted network of service providers. We can bring the right people to do the right job for the right price. Next, please. So, the first step any of you need to do, and I think if you're here, it indicates that you want to do this, is you have to decide to go green. And I think management companies can play a role in helping their clients decide to go green. I think there are a few places where we should recommend an energy efficiency opportunities analysis. I think it should be recommended, much like we now have an industry standard for annual end-of-year financial audits, much like we have an industry standard for every 4 years conducting a replacement reserve study. I think in the future, we're going to have an industry standard for these types of analyses, and I think it can be done for any client that has an expressed interest. Certainly, I would encourage new clients in our portfolio to look at this, and I note here, any existing client undertaking a replacement reserve study, there are a number of engineering firms out there that are beginning to add energy savings calculations into their reserve studies. For a little bit more money, they'll basically do an analysis for you while they're doing a reserve. It's a great way to kill two birds with one stone. Next, please. So a little bit about the project life cycle. We're going to talk about it in 3 phases, and I think it's important to take a phased approach. It's also very important to take a strategic approach. Invariably, anytime I go to a board meeting and I talk about green, somebody raises their hand and says, let's change all the windows. Hold on. Please, that could be a very, very expensive project. Changing the windows in a condo, as you know, could cost upwards of $1 million depending on the size of your building. You might get the same energy savings by changing the pressurization of your building by tweaking your ventilation system for a couple $1,000 as you would get for changing $1 million worth of windows. But anyway, back to the slide. Phase 1, information gathering. Phase 2, project development. Phase 3, implementation. And I'll go into those in more detail. Next slide, please. So, information gathering. First thing, and I'm glad to hear that Sarah mentions, review your governing documents. I cannot make this point clear enough. Understand what are the roles and responsibilities and authorities for all parties. You as a condo might want to encourage your residents to buy Energy Star appliances, but you can't mandate it. So be sure to keep that in mind. 2, initial opportunities analysis. A full analysis can be expensive. I recommend to get the ball rolling, to build consensus, to focus your measures, do an initial analysis. I know folks like Brian do them all the time. You can, if you're lucky, get something for around $1,000 depending. Don't quote me on that here, guys. And that really can be something that can help galvanize the community and the board into action to getting a bigger analysis. Those can cost, and I don't know if these costs are true across the board, but depending on the size of your building, I've seen about $100 to $150 per unit. So if you have a 100-unit building, that could be expensive. These types of analyses use DOE-approved modeling software, and a good analysis is going to give you a prioritized list of conservation measures. And they're going to prioritize it based on lowest cost and highest impact. If somebody hands you an analysis and it says the first thing you should do is change your boiler and change your chiller, fire them immediately. You don't want to do big ticket, big cost items first. Do those after you've exhausted the low-hanging fruit. And finally, collaboratively with your management company, with your technical experts, with your board of directors, with your green team, and with the participation of your tenants and your residents in your community, develop a draft project plan. Do it together. Build consensus. Build it early. Next slide. Some typical focus areas. They fall into 4 broad buckets, and I'm not going to get into details. If you want to ask me later, by all means, I'll answer questions. Electrical, mechanical and HVAC systems, plumbing, and other. Next slide. So you've done your information gathering, you've done your homework, everyone's on board, you're ready to put something together. The first and most important step is securing financial incentives. Securing financing incentives, pardon me. And ultimately, the ability to do these projects in your condominium is going to be dependent on your ability to pay for them. So, I recommend, as board members, talk to your accountants, talk to your auditors, talk to your investment advisors, find out what kind of money you have to work with. Typically, the answer is none, in which case you're going to have to go to a bank. And plenty of banks, like Monument Bank, who's a sponsor of this event, are glad to provide this kind of lending in the community. The most important thing here, and the biggest game changer though, are incentives. And it's often very difficult for people to understand what's available, how they can get them. It's like, they're like shooting stars. They're here one second, they're gone the next. It's important to have somebody that has their ear to the ground, that can bring these resources to bear for you and your community. There are two that I want to point out really quickly here that apply to condos in Montgomery County. First is the Montgomery County Commercial and Multifamily Grant Program. This is being administered by our wonderful folks at the county DEP. There's $1.7 million in stimulus funds aimed squarely at you. All right? 2 rounds of applications, 50% of funding in each round. First round apps are due April 15th, second round May 15th. It sounds close, it is. If you want to do it, you need to move, and you need to move quickly. Thankfully, the applications are fairly straightforward, and there are people that can help you do it. This grant will provide 50% of project costs up to $75,000. If you've been putting off replacing your chiller because it's going to cost $150,000, now's the time. This is a once-in-a-lifetime, well, maybe not once-in-a-lifetime, but certainly a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Second, Pepco's Commercial and Industrial Energy Savings Program. This is fun. This is administered by engineers. The applications are difficult. The criteria are obtuse. Working with them is a major, major headache. It is beyond my ability and the ability of anybody in this room to fill out an incentive application for anything they offer. But don't be afraid. There's a way around it. Pepco has what they call a network of trade allies. It's a list of service providers. It's available on their website. I've got a link here. These folks work with it every day. They know what the incentives are, they know how to find them, how to apply for them, and how to get them. Don't be afraid to reach out to the trade allies. And lastly, there are a bunch of hodgepodge incentives that MEA makes available. None of them are particularly appealing for condos, but I welcome you to look into them. Next. So, you figured out how you're going to pay for it. Wonderful. Next step, prepare your RFPs. Like anything else, use a qualified technical expert to build your project specifications. If you don't know what is going to go into replacing a piece of equipment or installing new lighting, find someone who does and have them help you write the RFPs. Step 2, competitive solicitation process. Like anything else that you are doing in your community, it should be bid competitively. It's better for everybody. Don't go with your cousin Joey because he told you can do the job. Get some bids. Find out who's going to give you the best price for the best experience and quality. And also, keep in mind, there are certain labor restrictions around incentive programs. So, for example, if you do apply for Montgomery County's grant program, there are Davis-Bacon rules. Who here has heard of Davis-Bacon? Oh, a lot of federal contractors out here, I see. Well, if you haven't learned about them yet and you want to apply for the grant, you will. It basically means you have to pay prevailing wage and have certified weekly payroll submitted. It's a hassle, but a good service provider should be able to comply with those requirements. Step 4, finalize your implementation plan and your contractual agreements, and I can't stress this enough. Talk to your attorney before you sign anything. You want to make sure that you're protected and you're going to get what you need, and you're not going to be held out for unreasonable amounts of money and get something that you don't want. Next slide, please. So, you've decided you want to go green, you've gathered your information, you've done your project planning, you've secured your finance, time to get into implementation. I recommend very strongly that you use a